everyone. I am Surabhi and I run Luchi and Mutton's dog behavior and nutrition. I'm based out of Gurgaon in India and I offer private nutrition and behavior consultations for pet parents and dog caregivers. I work with a holistic approach using science and empathy as key pillars in supporting dogs. Welcome to another episode of the Luchi and Muttons podcast. In today's episode, I unpack why I have stopped asking my dogs to sit and invite you to consider doing the same. As always, please share what stood out for you in the episode with me. You can connect with me via email or social media channels like Instagram or Facebook, details of which are in the episode description below. One of the first things that any pet parent trains their dog to do is to sit. I think that without it, pet parents are often made to feel out of control, helpless, not in command of their dog. You're likely to be judged if you have a dog that doesn't really sit on cue. Early research shows that while training dogs dates back to Roman times, it seems like obedience classes around the early 1900s, with the American Kennel Club popularizing obedience classes around 1935, made sit a really popular way to train dogs. It seems to have first been used in circuses in the 1860s and then in hunting dogs in the 1870s as well. But this was not for pet dogs at home, it was largely for working dogs. It seems like celebrity dog trainer Barbara Woodhouse popularized the use of sit. Apparently, it was one of her catchphrases in the 1980s show Training Dogs the Woodhouse Way. And you've got to remember that this is a time when the alpha theory was really popular, and there were strong critical opinions about having a relationship with a dog that was based on emotions solely. Respect was more to do with the dog respecting the human's position in the relationship, and it wasn't supposed to be mutual. And this is something to think a little bit about because when we look at the evolution of dogs alongside humans, we've shared a long history of collaboration and coexistence with each other, and that has largely involved no training and no use of sit. But now, sit is this universal thing that all pet parents and dog caregivers are expected to teach their dogs to do. And it's almost like the bare minimum that you can train your dog to do. But here's the thing, dogs do know how to sit and they do it naturally. And when they do, it has meaning and serves a function. So then, why do we spend so much time training them to do something that they know how to do? I'm going to come to this in just a bit. Sit has been popularized as one of the most important obedient cues to teach dogs of any age. It's expected to teach your dog to be calm and controlled and is used in multiple day to day situations like before food, before sitting down for meals, before giving a treat, before wearing a harness, being taken out, before receiving an object like a toy, sometimes before crossing the road, on seeing a dog, when people come over, before opening doors, or any time that the dog is really excited or hyper. My guesstimate is that on any given day, we probably ask our dogs to sit at least 30 to 40 times. And I know that some of you listening to this might go like, that's crazy. I definitely don't ask my dogs to sit that many times. And I urge you to maintain a journal to record how many times you do end up asking your dog to sit. But even 30 to 40 times is a whopping number. And again, I'm going to be honest, this could be on the lower or higher end for a lot of pet parents. But even as an isolated number, this is quite shocking. If I were asked to sit 40 times a day before doing a bunch of things, and some of them quite basic things, I would really lose my mind. At some point, I would just rebel and choose to not sit. Of course, if I didn't have a choice, then I can't escape the situation. So I would just have to do it grudgingly with a lot of frustration and also lots of physical discomfort. Let's not forget that. When dogs sit, they are using a number of muscles, actually more than what humans end up using. And so this is a full body workout that happens in a flash of a second, but it's happening close to 30 to 40 times a day. At that frequency, it is bound to cause additional or even early wear and tear to these muscles. And the thing is that a lot of mainstream training doesn't factor in the biomechanics of the dog at all, or even so much as an understanding of the skeletal system of the dog. And that's a huge blind spot. For dogs with joint issues, older dogs, and even puppies whose growth plates haven't fully formed, this can be even more painful. We're asking our dogs to repeat this workout multiple times in the day with potentially weak or injured or underdeveloped muscles. Older dogs, for example, also experience sarcopenia, which is age related loss of muscle mass and strength. So imagine you don't have the strength or the mass to support the movement, but you are repeatedly being asked to sit and then get up, and then sit and then get up. If you've ever seen senior citizens or elderly folks sit and get up, they try to keep that as minimum as possible, sometimes even needing an extra pair of hands for support. In fact, I remember my grandmother couldn't sit for a very long period of time. Like her feet would swell up, or she wouldn't get enough circulation in her legs. And it was extremely unpleasant, extremely uncomfortable, and even painful for her. Some of our homes also don't have dog friendly flooring, and this is a big problem. Dogs are digitigrade, which means that they walk on their toes, which is honestly the human equivalent of walking in stilettos. So, if you've ever worn stilettos and have had to sit on uncomfortable flooring, you know that that can be quite painful. And again, if you've never had a chance to wear stilettos, let me just clarify it is an uncomfortable and challenging posture to hold. I used to see this with Mutton quite a bit. Like when she would sit on the smooth flooring, her hind legs would slip a bit, and it would also seem like her back legs were slightly splayed. And I can only imagine how uncomfortable and a sense of like loss of balance that she would feel in those moments. Getting up from a position like that would also require incredible amount of effort and strength. Not to forget that I've also seen people ask their dogs to sit on the side of the road or cemented ground during peak summer, and it baffles me that they can't think about how uncomfortable and painful that might be for the dog. Or even asking dogs to sit on surfaces that they don't want to sit on. Like Luchi, for example, hates sitting on grass. She could be really tired, but she won't sit. But this is how we're trained to see our dogs, with a very mechanistic view that they should produce the same result every single time. And in this case, it means that they should sit every single time that we ask them to sit. And when they don't, we train harder and label them as stubborn or disobedient, or a dog who just doesn't want to learn, or even worse, a dog who knows what they need to do but are choosing to defy what the human is asking them to do. We never pause, and we never wonder, and we never ask the question, what could possibly be going on here? I experienced this with Mutton when we got her home. I had by then, of course, learned that the impact of asking our dogs to repeatedly sit can be huge and extremely negative. And so I was very conscious in asking her not to sit. But she also chose not to sit when asked, which was an interesting experience for me because Luchi, on the other hand, seemed to have come from a home that invested in training her. So she was very familiar with some of these cues, but Mutton would just not sit. And in her case, it was actually an early sign of incredible discomfort that she was experiencing. She had really tight muscles, very stiff movements. She didn't move her neck around too much. Her neck was a no touch zone as well. There were a couple of other signs that sort of came up, which pointed towards underlying discomfort for sure with her joints and her muscles. One of the scenarios in which sit is taught to dogs is when they encounter other dogs. For introductions or greetings, dogs really need to have the freedom to sniff each other and also walk away if they don't want to engage with the dog. When we ask them to sit, we're essentially interfering in the way that dogs are naturally prone to greeting each other. And again, we're taking away choice in that situation right there. With dogs who are reactive to other dogs, the assumption often made is that teaching dogs to sit in a situation like that could teach them either self control or could prevent lunging. But here's the thing, when a dog sees something or someone that they perceive as a threat, physiologically, their fight or flight mode is on. And this is any organism's way of coping with what they perceive as danger. And so, flight in dogs could look like wanting to get away as far as possible from the perceived threat, and fight could involve posturing, barking, growling, lunging. And then we also have responses like fawning and freezing. And so, whatever the dog's response might be in that situation, this is their body's response to what they are sensing as danger. And so, when we manipulate this in such a situation where our cue overrides how the dog would naturally respond, it can be extremely frustrating for the dog. If a dog wants to move away and is being made to sit while the perceived threat comes closer, that is unwanted, poorly managed exposure to that trigger. This, of course, is also known as flooding, but it's also a situation that can lead to incredible amount of helplessness and frustration. Imagine not having the choice to walk away from something that feels scary or intimidating or threatening, that you want to really avoid when all the alarm bells are ringing in your body. A physiological state like this could even lead to shock or strokes or even cardiac arrest. And it's so interesting that we're talking about this because I recently came across an article on how compliance can override senses of interoception. And again, interoception, very briefly, is just the awareness and a sense of what's going on in the body and how that's making you feel. And so when we place an incredible amount of emphasis on compliance, we take away or we diminish that sense of interoception, which is extremely useful and vital to each and every organism. So, teaching your dog to sit on cue in the face of triggers is not a healthy coping mechanism. A dog operating from a fight response feels the need to protect themselves. And when we ask them to sit in such a state, we're still exposing them to something that they think they need to fight with or from, but we're also rendering them defenseless because we've asked them now to sit. It's the same principle, really. I'm taking away complete agency from the dog. And that lack of agency, especially in situations like this, can be extremely detrimental to a dog's state of mind. It's also really, really important to recognize that dogs have their own coping strategies. In stressful situations, dogs are likely to sniff, pace around, pee, poop, pick up something to hold in their mouths, or exhibit other behaviors. When we ask them to only sit, we also prevent them from coping in the way that they want to. It's like forcing someone to sit down when they're extremely anxious or stressed or nervous, and when their way of coping really might be to pace around, right? It can be extremely frustrating and limiting, and it does not allow the body and us, the individual, to respond in the way that we are naturally inclined to do. The other popular premise for teaching sit is that it's used for teaching dogs self control, especially during meal times or when guests come over, or getting into cars or out of them, and so on. But to be really honest, there doesn't seem to be enough evidence around this. And again, here I'm going to sort of share a little bit of what I found with scientific papers, but I also want to have a deeper conversation about the look of self control. So, in a study done by Miller and a couple of others, two groups of dogs were tested to understand which group exercised self control. One group of dogs was made to sit for 10 minutes, and it's important to note that researchers refer to this as self control depletion. And another group was kept in a cage but free to roam. They then had to enter a room where a growling, aggressive dog was also in a cage. They found that dogs who were depleted and tired, by the way, of sitting consistently for 10 minutes engaged in more risky behaviors like staying closer to the aggressive dog than dogs who were allowed to roam around in their cage. So basically, it's fair to say then that when that sense of self control is depleted, decision making and judgment might also be negatively affected, right? And here, self control could essentially be wanting to not sit, wanting to move around, wanting to move in a way that feels natural and free to the individual, to the being in that very moment. I think the other perspective to share is to think about what does self-control look like, right? Often we ask our dogs to sit before an exciting event or something that's likely to get them really hyper, and we think that them sitting perfectly means that they are calm and they are in control. But the fact of the matter is that that's what we're seeing on the surface. We don't know what their internal state of being is, and their internal state of being could be completely different from what we're seeing on the face of it. And I think that's a really important distinction to keep in mind, right? That, and I say this, I use this example a lot when I'm chatting with my own clients, which is, I struggle with anxiety, and in so many situations that are um, difficult for me to cope with, I still have to sort of perform, and I still have to create this perception of control and grace and calmness. But I know that behind that veil of calmness, I am really struggling. I can feel my pulse rate go up. I can feel my palms get really sweaty. I start feeling really suffocated. And I am feeling all of those things internally while maintaining the facade of calmness and control. And I think that's a very, very important experience for us to keep in mind, that while sit can give you the facade of calmness and control, we don't know that it is actually teaching the dog any self control, or if it's actually teaching the dog how to be calm, because we are completely unaware of their internal state of being at that point in time. I also think that it's important to understand some of these behaviors more contextually and consider whether sit is really the best way to address them. So, for instance, we know that jumping is an epileptic behavior or a connection seeking behavior. That's quite a mouthful. And so, if we consider why the dog is engaging in that behavior, then we can find ways to support our dog to cope better, as opposed to just using sit and not allowing the dog to express the behavior that's naturally occurring for them at that time. And again, when we don't allow dogs to express behaviors that are natural to them, it can lead to an incredible amount of frustration, and that frustration can lead to a growing number of quote unquote problem behaviors. Similarly, it's worth thinking about whether we need to ask our dogs to sit before placing their food bowls. I mean, I keep thinking about if someone were to present my favorite food to me, but before giving it to me, ask me to perform certain behaviors that they want me to do because they think I should, or I had to meet certain conditions, and some of these conditions are really vague and abstract, right? And that's the only way that I can get food. One, I don't think I'm learning any self control in the process. I will perhaps do it because the human on the other hand is holding something that's extremely dear and valuable to me. But in all likelihood, I am going to be extremely restless, extremely impatient, very irritated, very frustrated with this entire routine. And eventually, I'm just going to feel extremely frustrated and uncomfortable around this individual. And I think holding space for that empathy is important again, because our dogs are sentient beings. They are not machines. They have very valid experiences and emotions. And I think it's important to start factoring those aspects in the way that we engage with them and in the kind of expectations that we have of them. But here's the real thing as well. Dogs do sit naturally. It's not something that they necessarily need to be taught. Dogs use their bodies to communicate with other dogs and humans, and sitting, when seen in the context of this communication, can be seen as a calming signal. that dogs use to communicate with others. But not all dogs may choose to communicate via sitting. Some may lick their lips, some may yawn, some may sniff the ground, some may lift their paws. I mean, they have such a vast repertoire of signals that they use in communication. And for instance, and this is very very specific, to my dogs, Lucy, she never really sits. She never chooses to sit. She sniffs a lot. She licks her lips. She even yawns when she engages with other dogs. But Mutton, on the other hand, is more likely to sit. And so each dog also communicates very differently. And we don't know what each signal means or why dogs choose certain signals in what contexts. But if we ask our dogs to always sit, not only are we robbing them of their choice to communicate the way that they want, but honestly, we could potentially be causing a lot of miscommunication as well, just by our interference. It's like, someone telling me that the only way to greet people appropriately is if I hug them. And so every time someone comes over, the expectation is that I have to hug them. I mean, do you see how inappropriate and uncomfortable and even violating that can be in this very context of communication between dogs and human beings? It's also important to remember that dogs who growl and bark and even lunge, I mean, this is all communication, right? We refer to these as distance creating signals. And so when we ask a dog to only sit, we are also taking away the choice for the dog to ask for more space and distance from whatever they're perceiving as threat. The other thing to keep in mind is that with time, it just gets really hard to unlearn these behaviors. And it happens to human beings as well. For all of us who have been on this journey of holding certain beliefs about our relationships with dogs and who are, moving towards another end of that spectrum, unlearning is hard. And after years of reinforcement with our dogs, it can be extremely hard to suddenly stop sitting. After a point, like, you don't even have to say the word sit. Dogs just know that they have to sit in anticipation of a reward. And with Luchi specifically, I spent so much time untraining her, and it was a long process. And I think that even today, while we're much much better, I think I do see with certain individuals in the family, she does fall into those learned patterns of behavior. So what is then the alternative to sit? Honestly, it completely and totally depends on what you're using sit for as a solution. But here's what I need to tell you: there's always an alternative to sit. I have found those for my dogs, for so many of the scenarios that I've mentioned earlier. And I continue to support my clients in finding alternatives to similar scenarios that they experience. So it's definitely possible, but I do think that it is very, very contextual. And it depends on the scenario that your dog and you are in and what the solution in that specific scenario, individualized to your dog, could look like. All right, there you have it. Hopefully, this resonated with you. Hopefully, you found aha moments along the way in this conversation. If you did, please write to me. Let me know what stood out to you in this episode. You can reach out to me through multiple ways. All of the details are in the episode description below. And thank you so much for being here and listening in. I will see you very soon in the next episode. Till then, lots of love to your dogs and you from Luchi, Mutton, and I.